Hi everybody, great to have so many people joining. I think we've still got a few people dropping in, so I will just give it a minute before we start. Okay, so we've had a few more join us, so let's begin. So thank you all for joining us here today. My name is Alice Tidswell. I am a lead consultant in SLR's ESG Strategic Advisory team, and I head up our climate adaptation planning and design solution area. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Matt Roberts. Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Roberts. I'm one of the technical directors in SLR, and I also co-lead the climate resilience and net zero team for our European region. Delighted to join Alice today to talk about dynamic adaptive pathways. Thanks, Alice.
Cheers. So before we begin, I'm just going to run through a little bit of housekeeping. To avoid background noise, we have muted all participants, but please do share your questions and comments with us in the chat function. Hopefully you can all see that on screen. And thank you to those who have sent questions in advance. We will be using these to form part of our discussion later on in today's webinar. But yes, please do send questions throughout. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little bit of background on SLR, we are a global strategy and management consulting practice spanning 6 regions and offering services in over 35 different technical areas, covering environment, engineering, science, and advisory. Next slide, please. So this is part of our TCFD webinar series today. This is the 4th webinar that we are hosting as part of our 4-part series, which has been designed to take you through the different stages of TCFD alignment and integration into your business and financial decision making. We've previously covered scenario narratives and financial modelling, and in our last session we covered risk integration and climate risk indicators, which hopefully leads us nicely into today's webinar, where we'll be taking a look at how we can take the learnings from the previous 3 to develop adaptation plans using adaptive pathways approaches. Adaptation is often an underreported aspect of climate resilience, so hopefully today's session will provide you with a broad overview of the what, the where, the why, the hows, everything around adaptation planning to help you start thinking about it and thinking about how you can use your TCFD process to bring yourself in line with adaptation planning and adaptive planning pathways. Next slide, please. So in today's agenda, it's very high level. We're going to be covering everything and everything before we go into a bit of a discussion at the end. So let's start with the what. Next slide, please. So what do we actually mean by adaptation planning? And before we dive into the details, I think it's important to understand more broadly what we mean by adaptation planning. So adaptation planning is the process of preparing for a changing climate to reduce the vulnerability of an organisation or a defined receptor and to reduce the impacts felt by the organisation or the receptor. Now, adaptation planning can take many different forms, and it depends on the use case, the organisation, and why you're thinking about adaptation. I've got a few different examples of types of adaptation on screen here. So we have things like eco-based adaptation, and this is a very nature-based focused approach that uses ecosystem services to reduce vulnerability and help support adaptation practices. And this is more applicable for organisations that depend quite heavily on natural resources. We also have things like community-based adaptation, where we rely on engagement with local communities and vulnerable groups who are at risk from climate impacts. And this is a very bottom-up approach to climate adaptation. And this might be more applicable for local authorities or municipals. And then we have risk-based approaches. And this links in more nicely with our TCFD work. And this talks about this is a more structured approach, which uses the processes that you'll have taken as part of your TCFD alignment. So identifying risks and opportunities, characterizing them, setting climate risk indicators, managing and monitoring them, and this then feeds into your adaptation plan. And finally, and the subject of today's conversation, is adaptive pathways. And this is a more flexible scenario-based approach that uses the information that we draw from our TCFD work to help develop different adaptation pathways or a sequence of actions that reduce the potential for lock-ins and account for the uncertainty associated with climate change. And I'll be covering this more in the rest of our presentation. Next slide, please. So just in a little bit more detail, when we talk about adaptive pathways planning, this is an example of what it looks like. And for those that have attended the previous webinar on risk integration, hopefully the diagram on the screen will look a bit more familiar to you guys, but I'll go through it in a little bit more detail as well. So adaptive pathways planning is an anticipatory approach rather than a responsive approach. So it's about being proactive. And the purpose of it is to recognise the uncertainties about the future and the future climate and take these into account when we think about our business planning and strategy. In the case of climate change and TCFD, the uncertainties can arise from future potential climate scenarios, which encompasses both physical and transition scenarios. So, for example, the uncertainty in different policy decisions, technological evolution, or on the physical side, the rate of warming. In our TCFD work, we quite often work with our clients to identify risks that are associated with different policies that may impact their business, or they may rely on new greener technologies that might not exist yet to decarbonise their business. So it makes sense that the management responses they have to the risks and opportunities they're identifying and the adaptation actions that they implement off the back of that to manage material business risks also encompasses this uncertainty and allows flexibility for a range of these plausible future scenarios. So in adaptive planning, the purpose is to explore these different plausible scenarios, whether they be policy or business scenarios, and set predefined decision and trigger points to determine the pathway that we follow. So on screen here, we have an example of kind of different alternative pathways that a company might follow as part of their adaptation plan. And these are defined by the different plausible scenarios of the future, the company's capacity or willingness to allocate capital towards them, and different decision points and trigger points. Now, when I talk about decision and trigger points, a decision point is the point at which an organisation should be just making a decision to move to an alternative pathway. And a trigger point is the final point at which this alternative pathway will be followed. And this links in quite nicely with our last webinar on climate risk indicators. And climate risk indicators can help inform these decision points and trigger points. And the purpose of this really is to have flexibility in our approach. Ideally, we want to be following this core pathway along the bottom, which is a no and low regret solution, which will kind of require the least amount of deviation from current business strategies and minimal additional capital investment or change. But we need to account for the uncertainty in climate change. And so these alternative pathways that could be followed that will no doubt incur additional costs or capacity constraints for an organisation.
Alice, maybe just a little point to add on that. So
yeah.
The sort of reason why there's that difference between the decision points and the trigger points is that when we make that decision, there's then some latency in terms of the actions that need to be taken such that you can actually change to go to a different pathway at the trigger point. So there may be capital investment required and infrastructure development to be built, etc. And some of those things can take some time to actually build or change so that you can take an alternative path.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Matt. Now we're going to move on to the who. So next slide, please. Next slide. So who should be thinking about adaptation and adaptive planning? Well, typically when we think of adaptation, it might be commonplace to think about infrastructure-based sectors who need to plan in advance for these future investments or infrastructure modifications and adaptation. But in actual fact, adaptation should be thought about by everybody. And on screen, we have some more obvious ones. So coastal communities that could be impacted from sea level rise, or farming who may be impacted from increased heat waves or changes in precipitation patterns. But we also have examples like local and central governments who are having to comply with national adaptation plans, or utility providers who need to align themselves with adaptation reporting power here in the UK. Also, we have companies like consumer staples companies who need to prepare for different physical climate impacts and how these could impact the source ingredients that they're using and their supply chains. And finally, things like companies like they're involved in financial institutions or the financial markets also need to consider how their investments are helping to close the adaptation gap, or if their investments themselves are actually resilient to the impacts of climate change and whether they have considered adaptation in their strategies. The fact is that adaptation is for everybody, and everybody should be thinking about integrating adaptive planning approaches into their long-term business strategies. So we've covered what we mean by adaptive planning and established that every sector should be thinking about it. But let's move on to the why. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So on screen, I've got 4 kind of examples or reasons of why you should be thinking about adaptive planning. Some of these might seem a bit more obvious, and other ones I'm going to talk you through. So the first is improved resilience. So adaptation is a key component of climate resilience for every organisation, the other being mitigation. In TCFD, we quite often begin by identifying management responses to manage the material risks that we have. One step further from this is then building these management responses into our adaptation plans and taking a forward-thinking approach using an adaptive planning pathways approach to support our resilience. Adaptive planning kind of depends on the different scenarios that we use to inform it, and this helps us align with the 11 TCFD recommendations when we think about responding to the resilience of our organisation strategy. Adaptive planning affords us flexibility, and this is particularly important when we think about how we're making our decisions in the future, how we're allocating capital, and what we're thinking about in our forward-looking investment strategy. For our informed decision making, adaptive planning accounts for this uncertainty that we have in making longer-term business planning decisions. It provides us with a clear plan for the organisation to follow, with a multitude of different pathways that could be potentially followed and different plausible scenarios that sit behind them. And this is all informed by business useful climate risk indicators that help us determine the decision and trigger points and the direction that the company will take. On the capital allocation side, it's important for us to understand the capacity or capital requirements that a company might need in the future for its adaptation needs and climate resilience. By having an adaptive approach, this supports the allocation of capital towards the prioritized adaptation actions and appropriate management of your CapEx and OpEx based on the pathway that you're choosing to take. So we ideally want to start with that baseline low regret or core scenario to limit unnecessary upfront spending and avoid lock-in. But the different scenarios provide us with an overview of how capital might need to be allocated in the future. And this helps us kind of set our forward-looking investment strategy and avoid kind of upfront costs or further costs down the line that we might not have been aware of had we not had an adaptive planning approach already put in place. So I'm going to move on to the when. So when do you need to start thinking about adaptation and building your adaptive plan? I mean, there's no good time. I mean, you could start now. You might have already done it. But I've got a few things on screen here of when organisations typically start thinking about adaptation. It will depend on the size of the sector, the size of your organisation, the sector that you're in, how vulnerable you are to climate change now and in the future. But one of the ones most relevant to this particular series is during the TCFD process. So we start thinking about adaptation as part of our TCFD process without even realising it. When we're setting the management responses and talking about how resilient our organisation strategy is to climate change, we're already thinking about adaptation. We're building an awareness of the future uncertainties that we may have in the climate scenarios we're working with and starting to think about different management responses to risks and opportunities. And the purpose of TCFD is to inform the resilience of your strategy and also future business strategy and capital allocation. And this is really pertinent to adaptive planning too. The second one is post-climate change risk assessment. So not everybody is aligning to TCFD, and we recognise that. And a lot of organisations, particularly those that are likely to be more impacted by physical climate risks, may have already conducted a standalone physical climate change risk assessment. And as part of this, they may have identified material climate risks that could impact the future longevity of their business or could incur large costs further down the line. So adaptation is particularly pertinent here because they can start thinking about how their investment needs may change to manage the uncertainty of future climate scenarios under high warming scenarios, for example, and help them to determine low or no risk actions they can take now and build in flexibility of their future business plan. And although proactive action is often preferred, and adaptive planning aims to support that, adaptation is quite often overlooked, and we do see this with some of our clients. And it's quite often overlooked until a company or an organisation has experienced a climate event or has incurred damages or losses to the business. And this is where kind of adaptation might then start to feature in the thinking of the organisation as they want to build back better. And taking a dynamic adaptive approach can support that approach of building back better and help them allocate their resources and capacity effectively to improve their resilience. And the final one is in response to legislation. So increasingly climate and sustainability linked legislative changes are coming through. We're seeing more and more of this. We had the EU taxonomy a few years ago that was asking organisations to consider climate adaptation as well as climate mitigation. And this is now being reflected in the latest CSRD piece. But we're also seeing it through national adaptation planning and more recently here in the UK, the EA permitting regulations. I don't know if Matt, you wanted to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. It's quite useful sometimes, I suppose, to sort of look at the evolving government policy around some of this, which is driving a number of these changes. I'm not sure quite where everybody is in the audience today, but from a sort of UK perspective, I guess there's been a number of key government policies and initiatives to promote the development of sort of climate resilient infrastructure and climate resilient essential services. And a lot of that stems back to the sort of Climate Change Act in 2008 now, crikey, which basically set out the policy framework to two things: reduce domestic emissions, but also ensure that the UK adapts to climate change. And that included two key parts, so that adaptation, so the climate change risk assessment element to it, which is on a national level looking to identify those risks, followed by what we call the NAP, or the National Adaptation Programme, which is sort of details on how to address those risks, basically. So I think the last climate change risk assessment was 2022 now, and that gave a pretty comprehensive analysis of the risks posed by climate change to the UK, including the risk to infrastructure, and also identifies those key risks and recommends measures to increase resilience. And that included things like improving design and operation of infrastructure and so forth and so on. And off the back of that comes the NAP, which the latest one has just come out, 2023, so covers our third National Adaptation Plan. So this is around the actions that government and others are going to take to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and that's from 2023 to 2028. So useful documents to sort of look into in terms of getting the background. And again, more recently, I suppose, is the green finance strategy as well, which ultimately aims to mobilize private sector investment into sustainable infrastructure, including projects that increase resilience to climate change. So that includes measures to improve the sort of availability of green finance and to provide the incentives for investment around sustainable infrastructure. So that's a sort of backdrop behind which, the private sector are now really starting to sort of ramp up their understanding and their requirements around climate adaptation.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks for that, Matt. Let's just move on to the how. So if we could skip ahead a couple of slides, please. So I'm sure you're kind of all here wanting to know how you should actually approach this. So firstly, it's important to understand that adaptation planning is typically a very collaborative approach, particularly when we think about the dynamic adaptive pathways planning approach. It's a very stakeholder-led response option and requires quite a lot of engagement across the business, across the relevant business functions that you've identified to ensure that the approach that you're implementing and what you're planning is widely applicable to your organisation, is universally understood, and the people who are responsible for monitoring and implementing it know what's going on and they have the tools that they need. It's also quite an iterative approach. So looking at the diagram on screen here, this is a bit of an overview of how you might approach adaptive planning. And 1 and 2 might look quite familiar to those of you who are going through your own TCFD alignment journey and are thinking about your risk and opportunity identification scenario analysis. In number 1, we talk about the analyzation of objectives and vulnerabilities. And this is kind of also where we consider the different uncertainties that can impact the decision-making process. And this will help us inform the plausible future scenarios that we have in our dynamic adaptive pathways. In number 2, we're talking about identifying the actions and assessing the efficacy. And this is where we want to start thinking about low or no regret actions, starting to do a bit of a cost benefit analysis of the plausible actions we might take to manage the risks and opportunities and uncertainties identified in 1. And this should seem quite familiar to those who are aligning with TCFD. And then we go on to start developing our plan. And it may be that you need to do a little bit of a reassessment in this stage, because as you start to develop the pathways for your dynamic adaptive plan, you may realize that you haven't captured all the information you need, or the uncertainties that are most pertinent to your business aren't necessarily being reflected in that plan. So it may be necessary to reassess. And then we go into 4, where we start mapping it all out. We build a map of what our adaptive plan could look like with the preferred pathways, kind of pathways that we might not prefer, and start identifying trigger points and decision points to inform the direction and the timing of those pathways too. And then it's time to implement it. And this is where having the rest of the business behind you and identifying risk owners and those who are going to be responsible for the managing and implementation of the plan is important. And they're going to think about monitoring it as well. And this is where things like climate risk indicators are going to be particularly helpful, helping you to have tools to input to measure the effectiveness of the actions you're taking as part of your adaptation plan, and also measure how effective they're being. And if we just go on to the next slide, I will kind of talk through how you can use your TCFD approach and our TCFD approach that we have here at SLR to start creating that adaptive plan. So on screen, I have a very high level overview of the TCFD approach that we take here with our clients at SLR, from the TCFD diagnostic stage and our gap analysis through to climate integration and disclosure. And whilst it might seem obvious to think about adaptation and adaptive planning once we've identified our risk and opportunities and we're thinking about integrating climate into business decision making, it's also important to start thinking about adaptation from the start. And we think that this is what organizations should be doing in the TCFD diagnostic stage, where you start to identify your decision makers through the interviews that we have with different business functions, and you start to engage your business on how adaptive processes can be considered when we're going into the climate risk opportunity assessment. It's important to understand, as part of this TCFD diagnostic, where the key uncertainties are that impact the future business scenarios and how we can support you to identify blind spots and manage them appropriately. And then we go into the financial impact modelling and climate integration stage, where you'll have identified your material risks and opportunities. You'll be thinking about the management responses and potential mitigation or adaptation actions you can take. But the financial modelling is really going to help inform how you prioritise these actions and how you allocate capital accordingly. Once you've kind of assessed your material risks and you have a numerical value to provide to it, you can start developing and understanding those potential pathways and the amount of capital you're going to allocate to different pathways in the future. And you can start thinking about the climate risk indicators that you're going to have too, to help inform your decision points and trigger points. And this is where kind of all of the work that you're doing as part of the TCFD comes together to inform that longer term business strategy and that integration of climate into the way your business operates. Now let's move on to the where. And where you should be disclosing adaptation plans in your adaptive planning is very circumstantial. You might be sat here today thinking about just doing it for internal purposes. You might be sat here because you are already providing TCFD disclosures either in your annual report or sustainability report and are keen to hear more about adaptation. And what we're seeing is adaptation plans being disclosed in a variety of different ways. Quite often organisations will have a standalone climate adaptation plan, which may or may not be publicly available. But we also see organisations more and more including adaptation actions or high-level adaptation plans in their TCFD disclosures or sustainability and ESG reports in response to the TCFD recommendation on resilience of climate, on the resilience of your business to a climate scenario of 2 degrees or less. And what we're thinking we might see in the future is adaptation plans being included in the management reports for CSRD reporting come next year. But first and foremost, adaptation planning and adaptive planning is for your internal use, it's for your business. It's designed to be a decision useful framework that has appropriate owners who are managing for it and are responsible for the implementation of it in your business in the long term. Now, we've only got 5 minutes left, but we have had a few questions come in earlier that I think it would be quite nice to pose to Matt and have a little bit of a discussion about. And the first one that we've had come in is, what is the difference between climate adaptation and mitigation?
Thanks, Alice. Good question, actually. Useful to sort of clarify, I guess, some of the terminology on this, because I think that, yeah, possibly those two terms often get used interchangeably or used synonymously, and they are not the same. So when we talk about climate mitigation, effectively we're looking at means of making the impact of climate change less severe by either preventing or reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So an example might be, as part of your decarbonisation strategy, switching from diesel to electric vehicles to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. Climate adaptation, in contrast to that, is the process of adjusting to either the current and the future effects of climate change. I guess an example of that could be outdoor workers are particularly vulnerable to higher temperatures and temperature increases. So the manner in which you might adapt to that is to reschedule work to cooler times of the day, or provide more frequent breaks, or introduce shading to rest areas and so forth and so on. So the difference is mitigation is making the impacts of climate change less severe by preventing or reducing emissions, and the adaptation is kind of adjusting to the current or future effects of climate change.
Mm-hmm. Really well explained. Thanks, Matt. Please feel free to continue sending in questions using the chat pane. We're here for another 5 minutes ready to answer them. We did have another one that came in advance, and that's asking about, there is a lot of uncertainty about the future climate. How do we deal with this in our adaptation plan?
Well, actually, what we've been talking about, I suppose, in terms of the concept of adaptation pathways, initially developed for exactly that reason. So it's to deal with uncertainty. So the approach that we're talking about, it allows, I guess, decision makers to take action under climate uncertainty. That's in essence what it's trying to do. Identifying what actions can be taken now and in the future to plan and adapt to those climate hazards. So I guess we know that most businesses are going to be sort of impacted to some degree by climate change, whether that be direct, for instance, from the climate-related physical impacts like temperatures and wind speeds and sea level rise, etc., or indeed indirectly through the sort of supply chains, etc. But what we're faced with is we don't know exactly when or how severely the business is going to be affected. So we need to plan, but we also need to keep our options open. So we need to modify our business sort of operations to be able to adapt to increasing risk from climate change. And I guess to get to the question, really, I suppose the major challenge in designing adaptation plans is the requirement to firstly accept the fact that there's uncertainty, understand that as best as we can, and try and manage that within the adaptation plans. And the reason for that is because not all uncertainty about the future is going to be eliminated. We've got to live with it. And I guess ignoring uncertainty could mean that we limit our ability to actually take corrective actions, which is really important. And so we could end up in situations that could have been avoided. And ignoring uncertainty, I guess, from the flip side of that, might mean that we miss chances and opportunities as well. So we always talk about risks and opportunities, and that's the same with our sort of adaptation. Mm-hmm. I guess people typically try and deal with uncertainty in a few different ways. People can try and use resistance to that, and what I mean by that is, let's plan for the worst possible case or worst possible future situation. And in some instances, if the consequences are so high, we might need to do that. If we're talking about a nuclear power plant or something, we might need to look at some of those worst case scenarios. But in the majority of instances, that can be a very costly approach to design that. Another approach is to sort of focus more in on the resilience side of things. So almost saying kind of whatever happens in the future, let's make sure that our system or our business operations can recover as quickly as possible. I guess what that does is it essentially accepts short-term pain, but focuses on the recovery. How do we get back up and on our feet again as quickly as possible?
Mm-hmm.
And then you can look at it in terms of robustness as well. So this is about reducing vulnerability across as broad a range of possible outcomes in the future. But what that doesn't do is it doesn't really look to model the future and identify sort of optimal solutions. And that's where this adaptive pathways, I suppose, approach and adaptation comes in, because we're considering multiple plausible futures, and then developing a plan that's essentially designed to change over time as we get more information, newer information coming in. So yes, I guess I was on a train journey up north, and I was coming into Crewe Station. I don't know whether anybody knows Crewe Station, but it's sort of the gateway to the. Have we got to end, Alice, or maybe
Yeah, I
move on?
actually think we're running to time here, Matt.
Okay,
So
sorry about that.
I'd
Yeah,
love to hear the anecdote about Crewe Station.
no
Perhaps we
worries.
can leave that one for another time.
No worries.
Just want to say thank you to everybody who has made it here today and has attended today's webinar. In addition to those other webinars that we've been running as part of our 4-part TCFD series. The entire series, I think, has been shared with those who have attended. And if you do have any follow-up questions, or you would like to get in touch with us about climate adaptation or TCFD, please do get in touch with myself and Matt. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.